Then I'd love to get us started and introduce Chinasa T. Okolo, PhD. She's a fellow at the Brookings Institution and a recent computer science PhD graduate from Cornell University. Her research focuses on AI governance in the global south, datafication and algorithmic marginalization, and the future of data work. Dr. Okolo has been recognized as one of the world's most influential people in AI by Time Magazine, a global top futurist in recognition of the UN's International Decade for People of African Descent, and one of 100 brilliant women in AI ethics. In addition to her work at Brookings, Dr. Okolo also serves as a drafting member of the Nigerian National AI Strategy, a consulting expert to the African Union AI Continental Strategy, an expert contributing writer to the International Scientific Report on Advanced AI Safety, and the editor-in-chief of ACM's SafeCast, Computers and Society. Her research has been covered widely in media outlets and published at top-tier venues in human-computer interaction and socio-technical computing. And on a personal note, I've known Chinasa for a few years. We had the opportunity to meet through the Mechanism Design for Social Good, now EMO, working groups, and had an amazing time. So I'm extremely excited to welcome her here today and to hear more about her talk on broadening perspectives on African governance in the era of AI. Thank you so much, Chinasa.
Thank you again, Liz, for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. I also enjoyed chatting with a lot of the faculty and students earlier today. As you probably know, this week presentation is a bit different from my dissertation research. I'm also happy to take questions about that. If you've had the chance to look into some of those papers later on today, or later, after the conversation or presentation. So I'll just get started. All right. As AI development efforts and efforts towards regulating the systems are increasingly becoming centralized in Western countries, despite the impacts of AI transcending borders, Western corporations that are at the frontier, quote unquote, of AI development are largely reliant on the African continent for natural resources like tantalum, cobalt, and tungsten, which form the GPUs powering large AI models, also known as foundation models, and human resources like data annotation and content moderation labor, which are used to train AI systems. Given that Africa is seen as the next frontier for AI development, digital resources like data, which advance the capabilities of AI, will likely become the next commodity exploited by foreign entities, fueling a new era of neo-colonialism. These concerns, along with issues of bias, disinformation, climate impacts, and economic inequality, elevate a need for comprehensive and harmonized AI and data regulation efforts across the African continent. This talk examines the burgeoning AI and data governance landscape in Africa, analyzing the impact of AI on democratic processes, outlining best measures for data governance policy reform, and also delineating priorities to democratize African participation in global AI governance. Globally, AI development is centralized in countries like the United States, China, Canada, the United Kingdom, and within the European Union. Despite historical barriers and present-day challenges, however, researchers, developers, grassroots organizations, and companies throughout the African continent have begun to make notable progress in democratizing how AI is developed, where such development takes place, and also who such development benefits. In many African countries, grassroots AI machine learning communities have helped fill in access and capacity gaps of traditional AI machine learning development, education, and training within African universities and also other tertiary learning institutions. And this has helped increase participation from communities that are underrepresented in traditional in AI development. Grassroots organizations like Sakane and Ghana NLP have developed data sets and also machine translation tools to help expand access to low resource African languages. Efforts like Deep Learning Dava, AI Saturdays Lagos, and Data Science Africa, amongst many others, have been instrumental in growing communities of AI researchers and developers within Africa through forming conferences, workshops, and study groups. Outside of natural language processing, specialized AI communities have also risen, focusing on healthcare, like Sisanke Biotic in South Africa, and also sustainability, like Afro-Climate AI. More recently, AI and machine learning communities have begun to rise in Francophone West Africa with AI Hub Senegal and Khmer AI in Cameroon, and also in Northern Africa with Morocco AI, the Tunisian AI Society, and Desire AI in Algeria. AI research labs on the continent have also grown in prominence over the past decade, with many traced to the 2020 four-year Canadian dollar $20 million AI for Development Initiative. This was funded by the Canadian International Development Research Center, IDRC, and also the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, also known as SIDA. Notable academic AI research labs on the continent are the AI and Data Science Research Lab at Makerere University in Uganda, the Data Science for Social Impact Lab at the University of Victoria, and the AI and Robotics Lab at the University of Lagos in Nigeria. There's also a growing number of formal degree programs in AI machine learning, such as the African Master in Machine Intelligence offered by AIMS, the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, an MSc in Artificial Intelligence offered by the University of Mauritius, and also a Bachelor of Science in AI offered by Kumasi Technical University in Ghana. Over the past decade, the AI startup ecosystem within Africa has also expanded tremendously. While estimates on the number of AI startups operating the continent vary, countries with already thriving tech scenes like Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt have shown expansive growth in AI. There's also notable activity from emerging entrants in the African AI ecosystem, which include countries like Zimbabwe, Cameroon, and Uganda. These startups are focused on a range of fields, including healthcare, language generation, and robotics, showing promise to help bridge the development gap and also move towards continental-wide innovation. According to Startup West Africa, 85 AI startups on the continent have received cumulative funding of $261 million, with the top 10 startups commanding $238 million and the top three $270 million. Entity, a company focused on decision-making AI systems for biology, logistics, electrical design, and energy, is probably one of the most successful AI startups to come out of Africa. It was founded in Tunisia in 2014 and acquired recently by BioNTech, a German pharmaceutical company, in 2023 for $680 million. Entity has more than 400 employees around the world at offices in London, Paris, Berlin, Tunis, Lagos, Cape Town, Boston, and San Francisco. Research data produced from AfriLabs, a network organization supporting innovation centers across African countries, and analyzed by TechAval, which is a Pan-African tech publication, shows that over 50% of African AI startups are in just 7 countries. Last year, I published a co-authored book chapter titled Responsible in Africa, Challenges and Opportunities. Actually, is similar to the title of the book itself. But in this chapter, we analyzed 102 African AI startups to understand the problems that they're addressing and also the implication this has for the wider African startup ecosystem. And similar to the work that was shown on the prior slide, we also uncovered similar concentration and operating locales of African startups. We did this work much more earlier. A lot of the startups we looked at were founded anywhere between 2008 and 2020. So it hasn't really recently accounted for, I'm sure, the explosion in AI startups, from the introduction of ChatGPT. However, we believe that as the AI system grows within Africa, it will be essential that AI services built on the continent include Africans from a diverse set of backgrounds and also regions. Traditional challenges with infrastructure, education, digital literacy, and unequal access to information and communication technologies, also known as ICT, have impacted the African continent for decades. The rapid adoption and burgeoning interest in AI globally have also amplified these challenges, highlighting serious implications for the advancement of AI in Africa. Given the large amounts of data needed to train AI systems, and the high number of computing resources consumed in this process, infrastructure challenges affecting African countries is a significant barrier to AI development and progress within the region. limited internet penetration within Africa can largely be attributed to infrastructure challenges like inadequate access to electricity and also insufficient investments in crucial internet infrastructure like fiber optic cables, cellular towers, and base stations. Africa particularly struggles with internet access, and in the last decade, internet accessibility in Africa has grown, with the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, estimating that it's increased from 8% in 2011 to 36% in 2021. Fortunately, plans are underway to begin improving connectivity in Africa, which is one step that is essential to ensuring that African countries can equitably participate in AI research and development. To Africa, which is the longest subsea internet cable ever designed, is currently under deployment and has 46 connections to land-based networks across 33 countries in Africa, Asia, and Europe. However, internet and electricity infrastructure is only one aspect of a successful AI ecosystem. African countries also lag in digital literacy, AI talent, and accessible and relevant data sets. According to the World Bank, out of all world regions, sub-Saharan Africa has the lowest percentage of citizens equipped with digital skills. This equals to about half of the average level of digital skills adoption that is seen globally. Thus, to ensure that AI is accessible to broader, non-technical audiences within Africa, there's a need to distill these topics for various audiences and to develop culturally relevant content. There's also a need to ensure gender and age inclusion in these efforts to ensure that women, youth, and older adults can benefit equitably from AI research and development. Globally, African countries also rank low in their respective concentration and production of AI talent. These numbers rapidly diminish when we consider the concentration of top-tier researchers. This analysis was done by Okolo, and they consider top-tier researchers to be those that publish at prominent AI conferences like Europe's ICLR, ICML, etc. When we consider the concentration of these top-tier researchers in countries like the United States and China, these numbers rapidly diminish and honestly are not even reflected in these kinds of analysis as well. However, research published in the Harvard Business Review shows that cities within Africa, like Johannesburg, Nairobi, and Lagos, are quickly becoming AI talent hotspots within the continent. Along with investing in cloud computing infrastructure, along with electricity infrastructure, governments in Africa must build the capacity to train local researchers and developers to help expand their respective AI ecosystems. However, given the unstable political environments and economies in some regions of Africa, efforts to train and retain AI talent can be hampered if brain drain continues to increase. The 2021 Africa Developer Ecosystem Report by Google estimates that 38% of African developers work in Africa for a company, with its headquarters based outside of the continent. This trend could also follow for AI jobs, but I haven't seen enough data to qualify this claim. However, it's essential that as AI talent is trained in these countries, that they're encouraged to stay and contribute to local economies through efforts that support local entrepreneurship, research, and innovation in AI. Over the past year, the African governance space has expanded dramatically with nation-specific efforts from countries like Nigeria, Rwanda, and Benin, and also to continental-wide efforts from the African Union. The Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs defines AI governance as a set of rules, regulations, ethical and technical frameworks, and similar mechanisms that guide the development and deployment of AI technologies. Data governance is also an essential aspect of AI governance as it provides protections over how personal information is collected, stored, and transferred, while enabling data subjects to control over the information and the right to be informed regarding personal data breaches. Given the fundamental role of data in training machine learning models, evaluating AI systems, refining predictive models, and improving AI-enabled services, enacting effective data governance can also enable more comprehensive AI governance measures. So now I'll get into some of the AI and data regulation efforts that have happened in Africa over the past decade or so. The increasing development and adoption of AI has dramatically shifted practices around data, spurring the development of new industries and revealing new forms of exploitation. These new complexities around data production, refinement, and use have also significantly impacted African countries, elevating a need for comprehensive governance, and enforcement measures. Approximately 36 out of 55 African Union member states, which include 54 African countries, and also the disputed territory of the Sahrawi Arab Republic, also known as Western Sahara, have enacted formal data protection regulations. 13 out of 36 of these respective data protection laws were passed by African countries in the last 5 years, and 24 out of these 36 were passed in the last decade and enacted. The first data protection law in Africa was enacted by Cabo Verde in 2001, and data protection laws were recently enacted by Malawi in June of 2024, and also Ethiopia in July of 2024. As of October 2024, Namibia, South Sudan, and the Gambia have drafted data protection laws that are yet to be enacted. Along with country-specific data governance regulations, regional economic communities and entities like the African Union have introduced data protection acts. The AU Malabo Convention, also known as the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, was ratified in June of 2023. This actually happened 9 years after its initial adoption. It was drafted in 2011 at the 17th Ordinary African Union Summit in Malabo, which is in Equatorial Guinea, and officially adopted by the African Union in 2014. It entered into force last year on June 8, 2023, after being ratified by Mauritania, the 15th country that needed ratification to be fully enforced. Regional efforts towards data protection have also been implemented by regional economic communities within Africa, like the Economic Community of West African States, also known as ECOWAS, the Southern African Development Community, also known as SDAC, and the East African Community, EAC. At the moment, there have been no regional governance measures, data governance measures, proposed or enacted by the Arab Maghreb Union, AMU, the Community of Sahel-Saharan States, and the Economic Community of Central African States. However, some countries that are within these respective RACs are actually members of others as well, so there is a little bit of overlap in these protections. At the moment, now we're going into AI strategies and policies. Only 25 out of 55 AU member states have a policy, strategy, plan, or guideline on AI, according to the African Observatory on AI. This could include a ministerial or presidential statement or a fully developed strategy, like that of Mauritius. While countries like Benin, Egypt, Mauritius, Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal have developed national AI strategies, Rwanda is the only country in Africa that has introduced a formal AI policy. However, it's yet to be fully enacted. Given such relatively slow progress in developing AI strategies, substantial efforts are required to advance AI regulatory frameworks on the African continent. However, I do want to note that, compared to the rest of the world, African countries are not necessarily behind in developing AI strategies, just because we only just saw the first AI policy or law enacted this year. But however, I think there is important progress to be made within this respective domain. We also see promising efforts to govern AI in Africa on a continental level, particularly through African Union Continental AI Strategy, which I've been fortunate to be involved in drafting efforts over the past 2.5 years. The AU AI Continental Strategy provides guidance to African countries to harness AI to meet Africa's development aspirations and the well-being of its people while promoting ethical use, minimizing potential risk, and also leveraging opportunities. The AU Executive Council endorsed the Continental AI Strategy during its 45th ordinary session in Accra, Ghana, earlier this year on July 18th through 19th, and it was formally released on August 9th. It's expected to be fully endorsed by the AU heads of states, essentially all African Union member presidents, at the AU summit that happens yearly in early 2025. So now we're getting to some of the implications of AI in Africa. It's introduced many challenges regarding misinformation, disinformation, and also bias and ethics, which have been a prominent, I would say, topic within AI research over the past decade or so. While the purported benefits of AI have promised to help African countries fast track development and reach the Sustainable Development Goals, these technologies come with many risks, many of which have already been realized in African countries and across the world. Additionally, concerns regarding the negative impacts of AI have led to a wide array of research investigating its impact in healthcare, employment, and in policing. However, much of this work is focused on Western context, excluding perspectives on how AI may affect countries in Africa and also the rest of the global South. Recent coverage has highlighted the harms that data annotators and content moderators in Kenya have faced when repeatedly exposed to graphic content in their work. As countries within Africa build their respective capacity for AI, and Western companies increase their reliance on Africa for novel sources of data, there are concerns that this exploitation can continue or even worsen. Additionally, the lack of robust data protection and AI policies throughout the continent could potentially lead to greater levels of misuse as AI grows in reach. While Africa is not the only region lacking AI legislation, as mentioned previously, African countries must make a concerted effort to draft AI strategies and move towards fully implementing them to protect vulnerable communities and also to enable responsible innovation. In recognition of growing discourse on the negative impacts of technologies like generative AI, my research has recently investigated AI-generated propaganda and disinformation in Africa, with recent work that's focused particularly on democratic processes like elections. So to get into this information, it's essentially the intentional creation and spread of deliberately deceptive information to mislead or influence people, communities, and institutions. African countries particularly struggle with disinformation, with research showing that media consumers in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa are regularly exposed to disinformation. Issues with disinformation have been fueled by greater access to information through digital technologies and services and other tools like social media. This is also an issue that's been exacerbated by the introduction of generative AI. Given the recent cascade of generative AI tools, understanding the usage and impact of AI within African elections continues to emerge. Reports and surveys have shown that African governments are leveraging AI to assist with voter registration, authentication, management, and engagement, along with detecting cyber threats and aiding in oversight and decision making. Despite these more positive or relatively harmless, to a certain extent, use cases, there have been many suspected and confirmed cases of AI-generated propaganda influencing electoral outcomes or precipitating coups within countries like Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and Senegal. This underscores the need for comprehensive documentation of generative AI use cases in democratic processes throughout Africa. So I'll talk about, yes.
You showed how some countries have more disinformation, and then you mentioned generative AI.
Yeah.
Is it having more disinformation because of generative AI, or they had more disinformation to start with, even prior to say 2020?
Yeah, so this research isn't, I guess, necessarily relevant to generative AI at all. I'm just mentioning like work that I've collected from, especially from like the African Center for Strategic and International Studies, has done a lot of interesting work on like these research campaigns. This is also like I'd say like an abbreviated version of a longer presentation, but there has been a lot of work from fact-checking organizations within Africa that have been manually detecting this work on social media platforms. And so a lot of the use cases I show here, for example, the Hollywood stars endorsed Obi were debunked by some of these fact-checking organizations as well. And reports from the rest of the world and media platform have also been they've been tracking this work as well.
Do you know of any reasons why there is more disinformation in those countries? Is there like more openness, or like why is it that it's?
I mean, it's hard to say, but again, I'll mention work from the African Center for International Studies. They have specifically shown there have been many targeted disinformation campaigns from external actors, particularly Russia, that target African countries, particularly those with unstable governments. And so I'll talk a little bit about that later in this presentation, but I can't necessarily like make correlations, as to, or I guess like as to why these countries experience more disinformation and but I just know that it happens on a severe level. Yeah. All right. So I'll talk about a very specific use case that's been interesting to me over the past couple of years, and it actually precipitates, like the introduction of ChatGPT and like all these video generators. And so political propaganda has been shown to impact coups before, during, and after they happen. And one of the earliest use cases of generative AI, before it became known as generative AI, occurred in December 2018, and this is specific to Africa. And this happened when a video claiming to depict Ali Bongo, which was the president of Gabon, who was the president of Gabon at the time, stirred concern on social media due to natural expressions and posture. Reports claim that this video raised concern about his ability to rule the country and sparked a coup in January 2019, which later failed. There's been another recent case with Burkina Faso's most recent coup in September 2022, which was followed by a series of AI-generated videos from American-based Pan-Africanists that appeared to express support for its new military regime. And I think this use case is also this case is very interesting because this information actually generated outside of the continent, but still had very interesting impact as it was spread throughout WhatsApp and also throughout Facebook within African communities, or communities within Burkina Faso. And so these videos were initially detected on Twitter and Facebook, and also again were shared through these messaging platforms. It also pose very interesting challenges for mitigating disinformation because of their respective encryption policies and or methodologies. Overall, generative AI has a strong potential to impact democratic processes, primarily in elections within African countries. Elections and generally can be plagued by high rates of disinformation, social unrest, internet blackouts, and also ballot tampering, as experienced in many elections. Particularly, as a Nigerian American, I've followed the Nigerian election, and I saw a lot of issues with that as well. And so many of these factors generally impact civic participation and also undermine democracy. The increasing ubiquity of generative AI heightens concern that AI through disinformation campaigns can exacerbate current issues affecting democratic processes throughout the African continent. Given the existing challenges with fragmented policy implementation and limited capacity for regulatory enforcement, AI poses a range of challenges for governance in Africa, but however presents novel opportunities to create tangible policy impact. While current development priorities like refining social services, tackling insecurity, planning for climate change, building infrastructure, and fighting corruption take greater precedence over regulating AI, African governments must concurrently work towards developing robust data and AI regulation. However, my recent co-authored research shows that African countries face a range of difficulties in meeting their technological potential, with many challenges appearing widespread and critical. These include weak or insufficient data protection regimes, such as Mauritius, also complications in achieving robust oversight frameworks to support sustained growth, such as in Kenya and Egypt, and also limited governance and economic resources to devote to technological and workforce development, such as in Angola. And I think that Angola is honestly a very interesting use case just because the government, as many other African countries, are focused on raw mineral exports, particularly in this case, oil. And the Angolan government actually just developed a multi-million-dollar research center focused primarily on oil and other fields, related fields like petroleum engineering, geochemicals, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure how much AI plays a role into this, but I think that as we consider the capacity for African governments to develop both comprehensive AI and data regulation, it actually may be more important to understand how these emerging technologies can play a role in supporting the priorities of countries like Angola, for example, that may focus on oil, and other countries that may be focusing on different other priorities or natural exports. Additionally, there are current indicators that may not accurately communicate African progress on AI readiness, and they confirm that the continent faces challenges in improving its AI capabilities. There are some recommendations, I would say generally that I have from my work that really focus on probably I would say like 6 main areas. And so in my talks and just in conversations with policymakers and other stakeholders, as with many other advocates in this space, really focusing on strengthening data and computing infrastructure throughout the continent, and really thinking about how countries, particularly Nigeria, can develop stable electrical grids, which will obviously be important in developing AI, but also provide stability needed to improve economic progress and output overall. Other efforts like expanding telecommunications infrastructure. Again, the Nigerian government has had many efforts devoted to this, particularly funded by the World Bank and other financial institutions. I'm sure other African countries have made progress similarly as well. And then also something I think that will be increasingly important as conversations on sharing the benefits of AI increase is establishing native, national, or local and regional community clusters. So another effort I think that will be important is obviously increasing regional and continental cooperation. Again, as it will be important for these countries to collaborate internally on policy development and also ensure that there is cooperation in terms of bilateral, regional, and continental initiatives. Overall, I would say my advocacy is really focused on enhancing a robust and comprehensive AI and data governance. And so again, these regulatory efforts should be systematized, and there should be improved pathways to increase participation and how these respective governance tools or policies are developed, ensuring that they meet the needs of local populations, and also that it increases the opportunities for Africa to increase, cooperate more intensively in these global AI governance conversations. So another thing I'm also very passionate about is really understanding how African governments or just countries can improve AI education and also increase AI employment pathways for residents in their countries. And just given how fundamental AI research has been to AI models and just like AI tools and services, it'll be important for African governments to revamp existing educational systems due to the many challenges that exist there, and then also providing formal AI training opportunities and job opportunities for these skilled AI professionals to help mitigate some of the concerns I talked about earlier regarding brain drain. Also, again, accelerating fundamental AI research. I think this will also come basically, as a byproduct of investing in many of the prior efforts that I mentioned previously. Again, making sure that Africa leads the stage in developing novel AI models and tools and not relying on open source models, particularly those from Meta, which have, I would say been helpful in advancing African research in AI, but these models don't necessarily, I would say there are limitations in how models, especially these large language models and other multimodal models, are able to characterize, non-English script and other, cultural nuances as well. And then finally, I believe that public engagement will be the most important part, of, I would say, creating just effective or just useful AI ecosystems within Africa, because I believe that, the average, African resident may not necessarily be aware of AI or even, I would say, concerned about its respective development within their respective country. However, we've seen how these tools impact people regardless if they're engaging with them or not. And so I think, I believe that public engagement, especially as we start the process of developing these AI policies, will become increasingly important. So also coming off of some of the disinformation topics that I presented earlier, I think there should also be policy measures that really consider, the nuances that disinformation and also AI-generated disinformation have brought to African countries. And so there are efforts obviously needed to engage citizens in AI, digital and media literacy efforts. However, these efforts will only be effective if measures are taken to stop disinformation at its source. And this starts with policy measures. There's, the ability of bad actors to evade detection and mitigation techniques that are set in place by digital platforms. Also heightens the importance of improved technical standards to increase the efficacy of these techniques, and then also increase regulation to ensure compliance and accountability for violations. While there's existing data protection regulations in many African countries, governments will also have to establish regulatory frameworks that can effectively govern the use of generative AI and other emerging technologies while promoting safeguards to prevent the spread of disinformation. And so this is a graphic that I mentioned previously from the Africa Center for Strategic Studies that mentions, these targeted disinformation campaigns that are, primarily I would say led or fueled by external actors as well. And so this problem, is very serious. As you can see, there's a very strong concentration in Sahelian Africa. And so this has had a very interesting impact on the geopolitical environment and ecosystem within the continent, especially over the past couple months as well. To help address AI concerns and accelerate efforts towards effectively regulating AI, African governments must harness the capabilities of their digital ministries to support the development of data and AI legislation. Over the past years, African ICT ministers, especially those from Rwanda, Kenya, and Nigeria, have increasingly become influential in global conversations on AI governance. Attending prominent forums like the UK AI Safety Summit, the AI Soul Summit, and also participating as signatories of prominent AI resolutions and declarations, like the United Nations Enhancing International Cooperation on Capacity Building of Artificial Intelligence, which was recently passed earlier this year in June or so. As of 2023, nearly every African country has a digital ministry, which provides a sufficient base to develop and eventually implement AI and data legislation. However, African governments must intentionally invest into their digital ministries, along with building AI ecosystems to address technical challenges and also develop novel solutions in preparation for the fourth industrial revolution. So I'll go into some of my personal work that I've done on this topic, particularly as it pertains, to reforming data governance. This is a commentary that I published earlier this year in the Foresight Africa report, which is published by the Global Economy Organization or Center at Brookings. And so we see that there are many existing continental-wide efforts towards data regulation, like the African Union Data Policy Framework, which was actually published in 2022. And this aims specifically to guide African Union member states in designing and reviewing data regulations, and also the Malabo Convention, which I talked about previously. These frameworks, offer valuable templates for African governments to adopt, but they haven't honestly been, I would say, embraced widely by AU member states. And so to help address many of these issues and also lack of adoption, and also potential challenges from some of the data regulatory gaps that we see in African countries, my recent work has proposed data governance reformation. So I'll talk a bit more about the framework I specifically developed to address this, and this will appear in a forthcoming paper that was commissioned by the UN Office on Special Affairs in Africa. I introduced the Rice Data Governance Framework, and this essentially aims to provide a high-level overview of the actions that African Union member states can leverage to operationalize data governance more effectively. And so in lieu of, functional continental frameworks like the Malabo Convention and the AU Data Policy Framework, there are efforts that countries, regional and continental bodies within Africa should focus on. And so first, this comes off with reforming the existing data regulation and also implementing sectoral policy regulation or reformation, excuse me. And so this reformation will occur also in, existing sectors like healthcare, education, and labor. Particularly, I believe that labor will be very important just because we've seen, many issues with data labeling and data annotation, and also data itself has introduced very interesting nuances around the field of labor, but also other domains like healthcare and education. And so it'll be important to understand how we can bolster this existing regulation with these respective, I would say, like characteristics that data has introduced. Next, really focuses on integration, which will prioritize collaborations with civil society organizations and also academic research institutions to improve the integration of reform policies. And what I mean specifically by integration is that ensuring that these policies that are reformed, are I would say fully present within society. So, for example, from individuals are aware of their respective data rights, and then also companies themselves are aware of these respective policies, which would eventually help improve enforcement, which is the last step of the framework. But before that, I'll talk about cooperation, which is something that I've also mentioned previously. And I think this, increasing regional and continental cooperation in data regulation efforts, particularly, those that are led by these regional economic communities. And I think they will actually play a very important role because there are, some African countries that don't necessarily have their respective capacity to implement data and or AI legislation on their own. And so these regional communities like ECOWAS, SDAC, and EAC will be very important in helping cover some of these regulatory gaps and also serving as kind of like the data protection head for these respective countries as well. And then finally, enforcement is, one of the biggest issues that, is probably something I complain about a bit, particularly from the African Union side. I don't like to compare the AU and the EU because, they're very different bodies and they have very, different circumstances that they have to compete with or deal with, or contend with, within. Within their respective, I would say like member bases, but I think that the EU has done a good job and also like set a great precedent, particularly with I would say efforts like GDPR, particularly, and also the EU AI Act. And we always see that the EU is very stringent on how their respective policies are enforced within their borders, and also how they, I would say, like go after violators, of these restrictive policies. And so I believe that as we increase cooperation, enforcement capabilities and capacities will also increase. And again, I think that there are national efforts that can be done towards this, but to fill in the gaps in national capacity. I also believe that regional economic communities will play a very big role in this, along with the African communities overall. So, coming to the end of my presentation, as African countries grapple with the potential benefits of AI, cautious approaches to building, implementing, and governing these technologies are needed. AI should not be seen as a panacea for solving development issues. There should be sustainable and equitable investment by countries towards building capacity for traditional social services while making efforts towards building these sustainable AI ecosystems. To work towards these goals, countries in Africa should continue participating in international collaboration and partnerships, and also focus on domestic efforts. They should also leverage expertise within their respective countries, and I consider approaches like Nigeria's, for example, in leveraging expertise from the diaspora to help in policy development. Overall, the ability of African countries to innovate despite existing challenges will help define its role in international AI cooperation as the world transitions into a digital future, which AI is currently shaping. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Does anyone have questions?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Very interesting. I'm curious if you know, like particularly on like labor concerns in Africa, if there are cooperations between the U.S. and maybe like the African Union on like making sure workers aren't exploited. If you think that collaboration should exist, like to regulate companies on this side or regulate labor on the African side, or what do you think?
Yeah, it's hard because when we think about like, data annotation, U.S. companies are primarily responsible for this exploitation, and I think a lot of the big tech companies kind of like to shield their responsibility from this issue because a lot of this work is contracted out to middlemen like Scale AI for example, Mighty AI and all the other subsidiaries that they like to develop. And so, yeah, I'm a bit wary, of the US being involved in these labor efforts. I think that, there are efforts that the US could do in terms of actually setting standards that companies should follow when contracting out. But again, I think we've seen how, issues, for example, with garment manufacturing haven't necessarily improved, I would say, working conditions for workers in, South and Southeast Asia. And I honestly we'll see similar issues in Southeast Asia, where data labeling is also prevalent in East Africa and Latin America as well. I think something that is a bit promising in my opinion is the formation of these African content moderator and data annotation unions, which have really sprung up over the past year or so, and they're actually like focused on kind of taking back like the responsibility in terms of trying to contract directly with companies themselves rather than having middlemen like Samus was, for example, do this work and set the terms for them. And so I think like this, worker-led organizing will be very interesting.
I have a question about like the deployment aspect. So we saw like AI governance and how it looks like both in terms of development and deployment. And while there are like data annotation practices and things that need to be considered, also like startups that focus more on like development, I wonder if like what are the factors that need to be considered for or like local and cultural factors for the deployment of technology? Because a lot of the times like OpenAI is more of like a service. So yeah, I just want to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because I would say a lot of my work really focuses more so on like the cultural aspects and the development.
Mhm.
But I think, you bring up very interesting questions that I haven't really seen addressed in the literature. And I think like these issues will definitely be addressed better as AI development starts to localize and we don't and we're not just solely importing Western goods or services like ChatGPT. And I think I think it would also be interesting to see how these companies, I would say, like tailor this technological like deployment and adoption, because we see how, for example, like these Western fast food companies like serve local, I would say, like foods, and they're not just serving like hamburgers and hot dogs all the time. And so I think there could be a similar model for technology deployment. I think this will also need to happen as these companies recognize the value of non-Western consumers, because I think that's why, for example, like Siri serves like Danish and Finnish, who have like fewer speakers in languages like Yoruba, for example. And so again, I think like local development will help address some of these issues. But I don't have the best answer for this, but I think the restaurant analogy was decent.
Yeah, thanks so much for answering that. And I would love to chat more with you.
I know that'd be great.
Awesome, thank you. Any other questions in the room?
I know.
So you say that we need to literate people about the usage of this kind of AI and establish communication. So I was wondering, we have many different stakeholders when we talk about such kind of AI development and deployment. So model developers who are developing this model. There are domain experts interested in the domain where the model will be deployed. There are policymakers, and then there are users. So I want to know your thoughts about how we can establish communication between these stakeholder groups and what role are expected from them for such kind of model to be deployed for decision making.
This is an interesting question because like when it comes to these larger companies, and I've been talking to like, different people here today and also just like reading research in general about like this, like idea of participatory development and how it has many sort of shortcomings. And I think that many of these large companies are not necessarily incentivized to leverage this free methods because they are still in this like, like move fast, like break things mindset. And so, and also like they would have to invest significantly in, hiring to like both developers, even just like, non-technical stakeholders, to actually like get feedback, conduct focus groups, study groups, or focus groups, all that stuff. And this is expensive and it takes time away, from things like developers see as like not important, honestly. And I think like, socio-technical researchers, ACI researchers, like in these organizations, I know they definitely try to do this work. I've seen a lot of this, participatory aid work led by researchers in these organizations, but we still don't necessarily see them translate into practice. And so honestly, I don't have the best answer for this. Because I just think that companies, big tech companies, really want to prioritize this. But I think there are things that could incentivize this, but I don't have a good answer at the moment. Excellent.
As a follow-up to that, and that's in various committees, like I think every single institution has committees on AI these days, and I've been part of several. And the one thing that I keep pushing for, because the question is like, what will differentiate academia or university setting from companies in AI? And one of the arguments that I keep pushing for is making an impact globally. For this very reason, that companies don't necessarily have an interest in maybe making the difference in Africa or I don't know, East Europe or elsewhere, whereas universities do have this mission of making a difference in the world. So I guess the question with your experience and what you see, like assuming the interest is there, let's say a university like Michigan or your institution rather would want to make a difference, like what would be a good way to engage without assuming that like, oh, we know it all, we come from here, like actually engaging closely in a two-way street with other places. You know, what are your thoughts on how to go?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'd say like leveraging, very institutional collaborations, especially, and I feel like, you've done that already in your work in chatting with some of your students earlier today. I see that. Like that's very apparent. I think again, it's like collaboration is great. We just really have to think about like what meaningful collaboration is. A lot of my work is grounded in ICTD, where there's been a lot of extractivism, from like Western researchers. This happens in other fields like sociology, economics, especially development economics, et cetera. And sometimes, in anthropology as well. And so really thinking about how we add this mutual value to communities or community partners or researchers that we want to collaborate with. I think that, there can be mutual value from publishing in top tier venues and providing like that visibility and access. But, what's next from that? I think that, funding is always like the most tangible thing I see as impactful, but also mentorship, providing those pathways, for researchers just to advance generally is something I see as important. And again, like thinking beyond the scale of one project, like or one paper, and trying to think about things that can be helpful in the long term. I think that's something that that can sustain over the long term. Is something I see as better ways to make this kind of collaboration or participatory development more sustainable and also meaningful.
Thank you. We have two questions on Zoom. I'm just gonna read out one of those, and apologies we don't have time for both. So one question is from Jean Canvas regarding resource extraction for AI. What kind of policy work do you see in relation to often exploitative resource extraction for minerals needed for AI?
Honestly, not much. In doing some research for this research presentation, I did see, US has, these respective conflict mineral reporting requirements for companies. I know NVIDIA has published about this. I didn't have the opportunity to delve into these respective reports. But I think like, this will be increasingly important, as conflict increases in regions, like the Congo, for example, and then also as like AI development scales, this conflict will only be exacerbated as well. I think that, it's hard for me to recommend African countries, I would say, develop policies regarding this. I think they should, but to be very frank, I think that internal corruption may limit the efficacy of these respective policies, so we have to consider that as well. And also there are different, many power differentials within the mining industries within these countries where they're owned by foreign entities who exploit local workers while also I would say driving like economic benefit away from the countries where these mines are based to. So yeah, it's a really complicated question.
Yeah, definitely. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and for the amazing talk. Let's thank our speaker again.